Welcome. This is the NCAA COVID-19 Coaches Webinar, and we are very happy that you are with us for this time period. I'm Joni Comstock, Senior Vice President of Championships here at the NCAA. My specific responsibilities are to work with my staff to conduct 86 of our 90 championships. That, of course, cuts across all 3 divisions and 22 of our 24 sports. We know that we share with you some disappointment and probably shock in the fact that we needed to cancel our winter and our spring championships. And what we're hoping to do today is to move as much as we can past that and establish communication, share some information with you, and confirm with you that this is going to be an ongoing dialogue to really provide support to you, because we know this is such a challenging and unsettling time as you're working with your staff and your student athletes and beginning to think about what the coming seasons mean for all of us. So we're here today to provide that assistance. There are 4 of us who would like to talk with you. And so again, we thank you very much for being a part of it. We will, again, be sure to continue to have communication with you about all of these important issues and share as much as we can, as quickly as we can, as we look forward to the coming academic year. I want to turn it over now to my colleague, Dan Gavitt.
Thanks, Joni. Welcome, and thanks for tuning in. My name is Dan Gavitt. As Joni mentioned, I'm the Senior Vice President of Basketball at the NCAA. And my responsibilities at the NCAA include overseeing the Division I, Division II, and Division III NCAA men's basketball championships, as well as the National Invitation Tournament for the men. And working in support of my trusted colleague, Lynn Holzman, who you'll hear from in a moment, who's the Vice President of Women's Basketball and her responsibility of overseeing the Women's Basketball Championships. On top of that, we all work to support our co-workers in academic and membership affairs and governance and enforcement and the Eligibility Center in helping this membership to make decisions and legislative changes and waiver considerations throughout the year, but particularly during this challenging time that we're all facing with COVID-19. We're in regular contact, as many of you know, with you as coaches, with your colleagues, with coaching associations you're part of. In our case, the National Association of Basketball Coaches on the men's basketball side. And we wanted to be here to be able to support you during this very challenging time of leading your student athletes and providing you with some resources, mostly from our really valued colleague, Dr. Brian Hainline, who you'll hear from in a moment, who's the Chief Medical Officer at the NCAA. Finally, in conjunction now with everything else going on with COVID-19, I'm part of the COVID-19 action team here at the NCAA, as is Joni and other senior leaders that meet literally on a daily basis at 8 o'clock in the morning to discuss all things coronavirus and to provide support to our senior leadership team at the NCAA and thus the membership on how we handle this pandemic and all the challenges around it. So, a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you again for tuning in, and I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Lynn Holzman.
Thank you, Dan. And hello, everyone. As already been stated, we're excited about this opportunity to share with you as coaches some information, hopefully in some different ways, provide some support and also information around resources. My name is Lynn Holzman. I'm the Vice President of Women's Basketball at the NCAA National Office. And with those responsibilities comes the oversight of Division I, II, and III women's basketball, the championships, and other stuff related to the sport, whether it's officiating, playing roles, working with colleagues in academic and membership affairs and governance, as Dan noted already. And similarly to what's been stated, we're looking forward today to providing some information from you and really leaning on the expertise and guidance that Dr. Hainline is going to be able to provide to us. So as we look and continue to work with you and your coaches associations and a lot of other stakeholders throughout college athletics, just know that throughout all of this, this really is a case that we have to work together to continue to serve our student athletes and provide great, safe, competitive opportunities for them. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Hainline, and he's going to introduce himself as well.
Well, thanks, Lynn, and thanks, Joni and Dan. Hello, everyone. So I'm Brian Hainline, the NCAA Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President of the Sports Science Institute. So my role really is to try to help the membership with regard to health and safety issues. And with that in mind, we work very closely with the Committee on Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports. So Dan mentioned the COVID action team, and I'm also part of that. And yeah, we've been meeting daily. Early on, we were meeting twice daily. And another group that I'm involved with is the COVID advisory group, and so our advisory panel. This is a group of 7 outside experts in public health, global health, infectious disease, and security at mass sporting events. And we meet very regularly. And we're just trying to keep up to date with everything and help the membership make informed decisions about what's going on. And with that in mind, we also formed another internal group, actually 2 groups that are working together. And this is an interdisciplinary group that's looking at the practice and competition season coming up in the fall. So what are we going to do in the summer? What's going to happen in the fall? And of course, all of this is predicated on where we are as a nation. And just recently, the president released national guidelines, which when you look at them, the way to reopen America, it's really very, very well thought out. It goes into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And it's not like there's all of a sudden going to be a green light where everyone comes back, but it's going to be a phased in approach. And so we'll be working with that, and with this interdisciplinary group, we're looking at all aspects of legislation and policy and rules and really how can we do this in a way so that the coaches have maximum flexibility, the students can really be ready to go when everyone's ready, and that the risk for injury from musculoskeletal injuries is going to be minimized. So we'll focus on that today. And importantly, Joni and Lynn and Dan, they've been getting a lot of feedback from the coaches. They've been speaking to everyone about it. And the real purpose of this webinar is because we hear you, we feel you, we know what a difficult time this is for you. And so we want to offer these webinars as often as is necessary. And just so for you to know, if you do have any questions after this, you can feel free to send them to ssi@ncaa.org. So that's the Sports Science Institute inbox, and we'll look at those questions, and we're going to find a way to get back to you. And if it makes sense to do more webinars, we'll do as many as need be, because we're really here for you. So that's the bottom line. So thanks again for tuning in.
So Brian, as we discussed, we thought what we would do is start with questions. And as you stated earlier, we've heard from lots and lots of our membership and many of the coaches just, concerned about student athletes. But I thought it might be beneficial if we really start with advice that you could offer about really the well-being and the health of our coaches. And so if you could talk just a little bit about things specifically mentally, physically, with things they should think about in helping themselves and also their families.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joni. And that's the great place to start, because this is a tough time. It's tough for everyone, and coaches are really used to their schedule. I think coaches, as much as anyone, they're really driven by their schedule, and they have everything sort of mapped out. And now all of a sudden you're in your home and in an environment that, well, you're used to being home, but not 24 hours a day. So it's different. And what we've advised to everyone, and this is really especially for coaches, is that when you wake up in the morning, you still wake up and you have a sense of purpose. I mean, you're still a coach, and understand that your actions really are those of a coach, and it's really important. But then it's having a schedule and sticking with that schedule. And that schedule includes, well, what's your morning workout? I mean, you should still have your morning workout, and your meals should be really scheduled. A lot of people fall into this trap during this period of time. They sort of fall off schedule, and the next thing you know, they're having 5 or 6 or 10 or 11 meals a day, something like that. So you want to map out your schedule. You get your workout in, your breakfast in, and then when your calls are going to be, and you have your breaks. You should set your breaks just like you would normally during the day. And very importantly, that you compartmentalize what you're doing. So don't try to do two things at once. You're with your family, but don't be double tasking that you're doing something with your family while you're trying to be responsive to a student athlete. Know, just like at work, that your time is your time, and then your family time is your family time. But make certain that they stay separate. Get into a very good sleep routine. You know, we talk more and more about sleep and how it's important for restoration, and especially during a very trying time like this, sleep is exceptionally important just in terms of helping with anxiety and really helping with just a positive sense of well-being. And then the other is to understand that we're all in this together. So we're all suffering, and this is really a suffering of humanity. This isn't just an issue for the NCAA or for the United States. This is one of those very rare, once in a century sort of things where all of humanity is suffering. And to find a purpose in being part of that. And I think once we connect with humanity and we find a way of maybe having a better sense of purpose all around. And so that's kind of how we've been talking about it. And Joni, I don't know what you've been hearing from coaches, maybe some specific struggles they've been having, or maybe just being thrown off kilter because they have no schedule.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's a lot of what we've talked about. I've heard from a lot of athletic directors, commissioners, and I do think that that's really a huge part of it, Brian. I was just wondering too, some of the things that I've talked about, I was talking with one of the sport committees actually today, and one of the things that they remarked about was the change of just sitting so much in this new sort of office environment. So maybe you could even comment a little bit and give all of us a few tips about getting up and moving around a little bit, or how else we can kind of stay energized in this new environment.
Yeah, it's a great point. And one of the things I try to do personally is to just have in the schedule locked in a lot of mini breaks. And when you have those mini breaks, those aren't mini breaks so you can answer 50 more emails. It's to get up and, you know, get outside if you can, or just walking around and changing. And the other thing that's really important, so we know from a neurophysiological point of view that your maximum attention span is between 30 and 45 minutes. And so if you're at your computer and you're doing one thing, once you go past 45 minutes, your efficiency rate goes down by more than 50%. So you should have these scheduled breaks, and it's not just important mentally, but getting up and physically, and I don't know, you know, do like 10 burpees or something like that. But it's actually really a good point, Joni.
Hey Brian, and along those same lines, you know, I think we got mostly head coaches on listening in today, all of whom have assistant coaches that they are responsible for and mentoring and trying to stay in touch with as they work together as a team, you know, to lead their program in these uncertain times. You know, I've, as the head coach of my staff now at the NCAA, I've tried to encourage our assistant coaches, our staff, to look at this outside of their work obligations as an opportunity and even as a mini sabbatical to improve themselves professionally, you know, to read a little more, to take on projects that they had been considering and never had time for. Any advice for head coaches about how to, you know, look after and optimize the well-being of their assistant coaching staffs, and any, you know, any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, you know, I think one way to look at it, Dan, is that, you know, we consider each coach to be a leader. And so when you're a head coach, you're the leader of your assistant coaches, and you're really the leader of the sport on that campus. And this really is a special time. So I know a lot of us at the NCAA community, and that we've talked to one another, in some ways we've never felt more connected to our staff, because it used to be we were traveling all over the country and everyone sort of did their thing, but now we're checking in every single day. And I love the idea of taking this time to even maybe enhance your skills as a mentor. And so you have your assistant coaches, and they're really waiting for your cue. They're waiting for your guidance, and you know, to be able to just take a little bit extra time, connect with your assistant coaches every day, let them know that they, you know, are gearing up for, there is going to be game time. And so we can't give them the timeline, and people like certainty, but you can give them the certainty that you're on top of this. And so I think the idea of making certain that that's a committed effort, and then, have some fun too. I mean, I know our team, this is a TGIF day, so every Friday at 4:30, we have a virtual happy hour, and because people are really stressed out during this period of time. So have some fun time with your coaches too. And Dan, I guess with that in mind, I'm just curious what you've heard as sort of best practices in general, how coaches really help their assistant coaches with personal development and career development, and how that can be enhanced during a time like this.
Well, we've done some studying just in the last year of men's and women's basketball oversight committees with the influence of head coaches on young assistants and on players. And the single biggest takeaway we had from it is that the biggest influence professionally in a coach's life, it has been either a head coach they've played for or a head coach that they've been an assistant for. So and I think we all know that as coaches, former coaches, that your influence over your staff is always important, and probably never more so than right now when they've got their own worries and concerns. Some with families, some single, and just getting into the business. But what they take away from head coaches' leadership during this challenging time is probably going to stay with them the rest of their careers. Yeah,
boy, I tell you, that's such a great point. And I can just, personally, I look at a coach in my, as a physician. So I look at my attending physicians who have been my teachers. And I remember in particular, during the AIDS epidemic, when it first started, and we had no idea, no idea what was going on. And the greatest teachers, they took us through this time of incredible uncertainty. And, we didn't know if you touched someone, was it blood, was it airborne? And they really guided us with just a sense of, solidarity, and we're going to get through this. And then I remember after 9/11, the first couple of weeks, and I was in New York at the time, and the great leadership skills there of the physicians who were really gearing up for what could have been just a remarkable, difficult time for the hospital system. So I really see that. It makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Brian.
So with the kind of discussion we've had thus far, we've heard, I think I'll use the word, this notion of needing to be vulnerable. And there's this vulnerability that comes with the uneasiness for coaches. And as we're used to as leaders being in this leadership position and knowing what's coming and the control associated with it, and just the unknown now has this sense of vulnerability. Beyond the coach, besides the head coach themselves or the assistant coaches, obviously the single most important group that we are serving here and leading our student athletes. So as our head coaches look to engage with current student athletes on their team, most, if not all of which are in different locations and not on campus, what are some guidelines or best practices or thoughts you have, Brian, that head coaches should just be aware of or consider as they're trying to sustain and enhance that relationship with their student athletes and be supportive?
Yeah, well, thanks, Lynn. And so one of the most important data pieces I think I've ever read, and this came from a wonderful study from True Sport, which is the educational arm of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. And their data were unequivocal that the coach is the single most important influence in a student athlete's life. And so right now, especially, that point of influence is even more important. So we've been really connected with the student athletes through the student athlete advisory committees of the three divisions. And the thing that they're most concerned about is actually their mental health during this period of time, because it's such a time of uncertainty. And we need to understand that for athletes, and we did this study with the International Olympic Committee as well, athletes so often define who they are by being an athlete. And the time that is the most vulnerable in terms of mental health symptoms and disorders for any athlete is transition out of sport. So if it's a natural transition, it's not so bad. But when it's a forced transition because of a serious injury or because you've been cut, that's when you're really, really vulnerable. And this is a forced transition, but it's a transition that is like, you know, it's not because you're injured or you got cut. This is like a, you know, something that's coming from the universe. And you think about that, that has even existential implications. And so the student athletes are really vulnerable right now. And what they have told us universally is that those who are really connected to their coaches right now, they feel much better than those who are not. And so what many, many coaches have been doing, and I'm sure most of you are doing that, is you found a way to connect with your student athletes on a really regular basis. And I would make that scheduled time. And you can do that when you're doing check-ins for, you know, their general sense of well-being, for mental health. Let them know that you're there. And I think the other thing that's really important, and the athletes express this to us really quite strongly, is that they feel, the vast majority of them, really connected to this crisis. And they feel connected from the point of view of social responsibility. And so initially, you know, some young students, and I think it was more students and student athletes, they just didn't take this situation seriously because they said, you know, look, I mean, I'm gonna have mild symptoms, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that you can have mild or no symptoms and still spread this disease to an awful lot of people. And I think for the coaches also to be speaking from the point of view of data and science and social responsibility, and let the athletes know, you know, we're all part of this. And so we're connected as a team, but we're connected as part of humanity. And so that's something I think is very important. You know, Lynn, I've always have been struck. I mean, that was one of the most important studies I've ever looked at. When, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, all of us who have been athletes, we know how important our coaches are, but it was unequivocal that the coaches are the single most important influence in an athlete's life. And I mean, I'm sure you must see that, especially in women's basketball, and what you know, what does that really mean day to day?
Yeah, and I mean, the information you just shared, I mean, obviously it's grounded in research, but even anecdotally, to your point, I think that's spot on, not just women's basketball, but across sports. And I'll point to an example of which I have a niece that was anticipating finishing her senior season of softball at the University of Akron. And with the pandemic and the crisis, she wasn't able to do that. So she's in a situation, an example like you described, where she was working toward that planned transition out of her sport, you know, what am I going to do for grad school, on. And now she's in this place of trying to figure out, is she going to go back to complete eligibility? How can she leverage that academically? What are her next steps? And then that connection, as she's talked about, with the coach, and knowing what's going on, along with the support of her her father and family members and everything, is absolutely vital. And as I've checked in with her, thankfully she's shared some of this with her, just the nervousness and anxiety that she feels around it, because that identity of being an athlete, she actually has potentially an opportunity to take it one more season, but yet what does that do for where she thought her life was going to go to next, on top of just the stress of what's going on?
Yeah, Lynn, that's a really, really good point. And I had the opportunity to join Brian, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, and we talked with the National SAC student athletes. And as you know, they're so incredible. They want to provide that leadership. They care obviously about themselves, their teams, and about each other. And I think, you know, that concern and for their personal well-being and their personal futures, it came through. But it's just so incredible to work with them and listen to them, because they're also, again, just so geared to the rest of their team and their teammates. So yeah, I think it's going to be so important that, you know, this webinar is just such a great example of something that hopefully we can continue to help the head coaches in all of the things that they're doing to help their student athletes. Brian, I'd like to go back to one thing that you mentioned just a little bit, and you know, again, just on this theme of the leadership and how great our student athletes are. Could you talk just a little bit more about that concept of social responsibility, and how the head coaches could help you know, and the things they could talk about with their student athletes around social responsibility, the things that they need to be sure they're aware of, even with family and friend responsibilities, all of that. Can you just elaborate about that a bit more?
Yeah, so you know, we have this thing. It's a weekly series. It's called NCAA Social Series, and so you can tune into that on the Twitter account, twitter@ncaa.org, or just go to the ncaa.org/SSI. There's a website devoted just to COVID-19, and it's going to be there. So this week's account actually is with a student athlete, a football player from Florida State, who kind of, you know, had I don't know, he was sort of a COVID-19 denier, if you will, saying, you know, it's not a big deal. And then his family became ill. His father became critically ill, and he became ill, and he really struggled. I mean, he had not suffered anything like this. And so we interviewed him along with one of the team physicians from the University of Colorado, who's also on the Committee on Competitive Safeguards, and just talked about what really does that mean. So in this case, you know, it took him getting personally ill and seeing his family become critically affected. And it was like a light went on and said, you know, this is really real. And so we're really widely going to push this to our student athletes through SAC. And I certainly would encourage the coaches to listen to it as well, because it's really thoughtful interviews, and it's coming from the perspective of the student athlete. You know, this, like we said earlier, we're all in this together, but this is a chance, I think, for you know, Joni, for sport to be a leader. When you look at society and look at the really tough decision that we had to make. So with winter sports, and you know, and for Lynn and Dan, I mean, the Final Four was eliminated. Joni, you had multiple winter championships and the spring championships, and you know what's interesting? We were all so bummed out to make that decision, but everyone said this is the right thing to do. It's the ethical thing to do, and I think the NCAA really awakened society. I mean, society was sort of like, well, you know, how big of a deal is this? And then when the NCAA says we're shutting down, I mean, the world kind of awakened. But you know, the way we continue to now work with COVID-19, and we're going to reemerge, we're going to re-socialize. Sports should be a leader in this too, and so Joni, I see that through the coaches and student athletes in a way. I think they combined in a almost magical way where they're showing leadership. They're saying to society, hey, we're going to get there, but let's do it right. And let sport be the subculture or the metaphor for what's really good about society. Because we could get it wrong too and say, well, we're just going to get back at all costs. And, you know, if we do that, we're going to be right back where we were a month ago. So I don't know, Joni, does that make sense to you? I mean, it almost seems like sport could take on a very special leadership role in society.
I think that's absolutely right. And we've already seen just, you know, the level of interest and support. And so I think we are going to see that continued emergence in leadership. Brian, I actually had one additional follow-up question. You know, we're all getting so many questions about, well, when can we start competing again? And I can only imagine the pressure and the number of times that our coaches are being asked, well, when, and how will we know? And could you talk just a little bit about how you see that the next few weeks, few months, and some of the key indicators about kind of, you know, how we're going to emerge from this, and some of the key things that we'll see as we know that we are?
Yeah, so I think there are three immediate things I can think of. So one is this external advisory panel that I referenced earlier. They came up with really what we call the principles of resocialization, and we're going to be posting those sometime next week. And it doesn't give a timeline. It just says, look, these are the requirements that are necessary for getting back. And you know, it's interesting. We've been working on this document for a week, and then just yesterday, you know, President Trump came out with the really how we're going to come back as an American society. And he didn't give dates, but very, very importantly, he talked about the different phases, and all of the phases are dependent on a sustained reduction in new infections. So phase 1, meaning we get out of this sort of stay at home and so forth, we start emerging, albeit somewhat timidly. Well, that means that, there's been a reduction for 14 days. Which is the cycle of the virus in terms of going to the next manifestation. And then if we do that successfully in phase 1, and there's still a continued reduction in infections, we go to phase 2. And phase 2 means that you're gathering more in certain settings, and you can be 50 people at one place, whereas right now that's not part of the general guidelines. And so you can imagine, really, as you're moving into phase 2, you're starting to think about organized practices and so forth. And so we're going to take those guidelines with the principles. And so the tricky part is, you want as a nation for there to be a sustained reduction in infections, but then at the regional level, the school level, which is always ultimately controlled by the state policy, that they've said, yes, we're re-socializing. And so you start building it around that. And then this working group that we talked about, which is, working very closely with Football Oversight Committee and a Competition Oversight Committee and Committee on Competitive Safeguards. So this working group is just gathering up all the information so that the membership committees can make the decisions they need to make. It'll all happen, and we'll be able to be nimble and make adjustments as need be. The real important thing, and Bob Bowlesby, the commissioner of the Big 12, said this after he emerged with others from a meeting with Vice President Pence, is that we're going to get back and reemerge in sport, but first and foremost, colleges have to get back, because it was a very, very nice emphasis that our athletes, unlike professional athletes, they're students. And so it doesn't make sense that you're going to have a reemergence of collegiate athletics if there hasn't been a reemergence of students on campus. So it's a tricky sort of thing to get that all balanced together, but actually I see a lot more light than I've seen in quite some time, because all of these guidelines are sort of sinking in with one another. And if we follow them out and we have a good sense of control locally, which is going to depend on testing as well, we can get this right. America can get this right, but it just means following the general principles. So I don't know if that makes sense, Joni. I mean, I wish I could say, look, it's going to be June 16th, but I think everyone would like to be able to say that. But we now at least know what has to happen, and I think we can work with that.
Great, thank
Hey, Brian, thanks. Back to the student athletes again. For coaches in particular to know what kind of resources are available to current student athletes through the Sports Science Institute. I've been able to, read some of your excellent work and the resources available to the NCAA staff, been available to membership, I think, for some time. But can you just describe to the coaches what those resources are and how to access them? Because I do think they're very valuable.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So yeah, if you go to ncaa.org SSI/SSI, and you'll see a COVID-19 link. And so we have resources in terms of your just daily self-care and an exercise program. So we don't get prescriptive with exercise programs, and we know the coaches and others, they're giving their athletes exercises they would like them to do. While I'm on that, there's still a struggle with monitoring virtual workouts, because there are some medical legal implications of doing that when you don't have people available should something happen. So that's something still being worked out through with legal and so forth. And then we have resources, mental health resources, and next week, which is when this is actually going to be airing. So this week, I should say. We're actually providing a link of a very, very large group of mental health providers who are doing telemedicine. And so it's going to be working out across the country. And these are all licensed mental health providers who specialize in treating athletes. And so we've been working really closely with them, and they've agreed to actually provide this page for us. So so we're going to have that available, and and the other resources, as we get feedback from this webinar, we're going to take your guidance. I mean, this is sort of our first attempt with this, and I don't know, Dan, if it makes sense to you and the others. I mean, based on the feedback we get, we can have this be much more directive.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, I'd certainly encourage coaches to reach out to us and offer suggestions, things that you feel like you're lacking in trying to guide student athletes through this crisis and the challenges they're facing at home or, in isolation with their families. I think, unfortunately, we're still in the first half, at least, if not earlier in the game. We've got a long way to go, and just trying to take things one day at a time. But I know those resources have been really helpful, even to me and my family, and hopefully for coaches, they will be also, and most importantly, the student athletes that you're leading. Thank you, Brian.
And Brian, kind of to close this up and maybe help provide some specific direction to coaches, our audience here, what are some things that coaches, after watching this, and they feel like they need to do something to start to get ready for what they don't know or not, they don't know when, what are some things that they could do now to start to prepare for when they can start engaging with their student athletes, their staffs, and others in a way that was more like it was before?
Yeah, I would consider two things. First, I would encourage every coach to really read the national guidelines that were put out by President Trump, because they're so science driven, and it just will, I think, help the coach get a sense of certainty. The other thing, and we did a webinar with Olympic athletes and Olympic coaches last week, and we were talking about, so you think of an Olympic athlete, they're preparing for something that's 4 years down the road. But you never want to think about what's going to be happening in 4 years, just like I don't think the coaches should be thinking about, what am I going to do for when's the season going to start, and what if it doesn't start on time, and it be very goal oriented for what can you do today that's really going to make a lot of sense. And so it's connecting with your athletes. You've read the national guidelines, you have a sense, you can communicate them with your athletes, how you're taking care of yourself, and then you have a weekly goal. So what is one thing that you need to accomplish this week? And so it is going to be certain plans that you have with your assistant coaches, making certain that you're ready to go. But I think during these times of uncertainty, it's exceptionally important to be really focused on what is going to happen today and how do I make today a little bit better? What's going to happen this week? And you think in those segments, it's like a periodization schedule, if you will. You don't want to go for it all at once, and you want to make certain that you're really, when the time does come, and it comes sometime this fall, that you're ready to go. So I think it's those incremental steps and the short-term focus, so that when eventually things do happen, you're ready to do it. If that makes sense. I mean, that's sort of, it's not just for coaches. When you look at people at any profession, and even talking to so many of the healthcare workers, I mean, how are they getting through this? And it seems, how long are they going to do this? They're really, really focused on today, tomorrow, the self-care, and the things that they can really manage and accomplish today and tomorrow.
So Brian, the responsibilities for the coaches, and there are just so many. And so, as you said, they're thinking about and concerned with their assistant coaches, their student athletes. There's a whole other segment, of course, of people who are leaning on them, and those are the student athletes who have committed to their programs, the prospective student athletes. And so could you talk just a little bit, and really I kind of think about it in two ways. First of all, just to clarify how they can interact with those prospective student athletes, but then also same thing, just is there anything different that they should be thinking about what they're conveying to those student athletes when they're talking with them?
Yeah, and so and I'll be relying on you all. You know this lane a little better than I do, but so we're in this dead period. So I don't really like that word, dead period, but in terms of recruiting, and we're in this virtual recruiting world. But it's still fairly prescriptive, how you can be with your athletes. And recently, Joni and Dan and Lynn, you probably know this better than I do. I think this was D1 specific, where for the 8 hours, the coaches now can spend 8 hours a week, even when it's off season, and they can really work through specific, videos or game planning or what have you. And before, I think that was only for 2 hours. So to take advantage of that, and the coaches really are able to interact with the athletes. There are many levels of activities that they can do, and even with those that have committed, there are activities that they can do. I'm actually going to lean on you all a little bit more for what's allowed virtually and not. But when you look at all the guidelines, the coaches are given a little bit of freedom in terms of this, and I think it's really important to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't know that I can play the role of the compliance person or AMA, but I think they can definitely have interaction, and I guess just acknowledging the importance of that. And we know that with the coaches, that those prospective student athletes can't wait to get on their campuses, can't wait to be around teammates and the coaches. And so it's certainly an important group to continue to encourage and connect with.
And if there's uncertainty about that, and because I actually do have this spreadsheet, and it's not right in front of me, and we can post that. I think that would be important for every coach. I'm sure the compliance person at every school has that, and so take that to the max, because it also, for the athletes that have committed, it really still allows an interaction with them.
Yeah, I just to add to that, I think that although the manner by which a coach is looking to continue to nurture that relationship with the incoming student athlete, the student athlete that has signed, coaches also seemingly, using the technology and otherwise, it is possible to nurture that relationship. But it also, I think, puts there's an opportunity for some different kind of creativity with that, as to how you continue to find ways to connect and continue to develop that relationship and that trust. I mean, we know from the goals survey and the research that's been done about, and we've already mentioned it several times here, how absolutely vital and influential that head coach relationship with their student athletes is. And in this time that we're at, it's just that we all, as we're finding through just our everyday jobs as professionals, but the coaches themselves, I know, have been challenged to find ways to connect with their current student athletes, and then those that are coming in much different ways, different platforms, but the opportunity is there.
Yeah, and I think, in the goals survey, just to put it into the context of trust, that was one thing that really came out as being very important. So that as you're going through this with the student athlete, that they look at you and they say, "Oh, wow, I'm really glad coach is taking me through this," and that trust relationship can really develop virtually, and sometimes, sometimes these relationships develop better virtually. I mean, you can be more creative. Sometimes people, when in the heat of the moment, things can happen, but virtually you can be more measured. You can think about it and really plan it. And so, we talked about it earlier, and Dan mentioned about professional development. I mean, part of it is personal professional development, and I think with the idea of trust more than anything else, this is a time when the athletes need to trust you.
I think along those lines, Brian, let me ask maybe a different question. We've talked a lot about coaches, about their assistants, about student athletes. It's also a time when there's so much uncertainty financially for institutions, for athletic departments, so loss of revenue and enrollment challenges. So, as a former athletic director, I'm thinking about, what I would have been doing with my head coaches and the relationship we have to trying to get through this all together, to support them. I always thought of myself as a coach for the coaches, to be there to support them as they were coaching their student athletes. And so maybe, you know, any thoughts along those lines about coach and administrator relationships and the opportunity to build upon those, or to partner in ways to support the coaching staff, but also to support up the chain of command to the administrators who are, you know, facing some challenging times and working with university administration through this crisis.
Yeah, it's a great point, and so we have had meetings with athletic directors, and it was interesting. A number of them they were sharing best practices on how they were interacting with their coaches, and again, you know, the thing they emphasized more than anything else was just the connectivity. And so if they're probably the first and foremost, if you feel that you are disconnected from your administrative staff, from the athletic director, it's important to reach out and to keep pushing for that to happen. It's you know, financially, you know, we're all sort of wondering what's going to happen, and you know, I think everyone is working together to make certain that something does happen. And even at the national staff office, I mean, we've all done everything in our power to sort of help the financial situation. So, you know, it's tough. It's a time of uncertainty, but again, it's just the connection with the administrative staff. And if it's not happening, you know, work with your fellow coaches and try to make it happen, because I think you're right, Dan, that's really key.
Thanks, I think it's a way to build trust, you know, and collaborating. And talked to a coach just yesterday who's kind of rethinking the way scheduling is going to happen next year, knowing that there are challenges to the budget, and so in this case, he's, you know, rethinking, at least for the year, about what their non-conference schedule may look like and how they can, you know, support the department's financial challenges. And it's an opportunity, I think, as well, to just try different things out, right? I mean, I think there's maybe a little more openness and latitude to experimentation in responsible ways, because, you know, I think everybody recognizes that it's a crisis and there's opportunity to do things a little differently and see how they work. Maybe they stick, and maybe you go back to more normal operation in the future if and when that happens.
Yeah, it's a great point. And also maybe even to reach out to your fellow coaches in a way you haven't before. I mean, because learn from, you know, because you know, we're all in this together, and we're all suffering to, you know, in one way with this together. But you know, once you start reaching out to your fellow coaches, first within the conference and beyond, you really, as Dan said, you might develop some really creative ideas. And I know the one thing with this cross-functional working group, the most important thing we're trying to accomplish is to be nimble and to make certain things can happen. You know, we know that this is a really unusual time, and so it's not a time to be rigid with the rules and everything else. So we've created, you know, 100 different what if scenarios, but as I've learned so often in life, you know, especially even from a science-driven point of view, you know, we used to talk to coaches and we thought, you know, we knew sports medicine and science medicine, but then we listened to the coaches and they knew much more than we did. So, you know, it changed how we look at things. And I think as the coaches talk to one another, you know, you may have really, I'm sure you'll have great ideas to share with the administrators at the NCAA, if you will, and help us to make this work, because we'll be nimble and work with you.
Absolutely. We're getting lots of really good ideas. And as I've talked to just, again, some of the sport committees, I've been hearing some of the same things that the head coaches are sharing within their own department, and thinking of things that they might want to do either to help their school financially as, you know, things get started this fall, but then also do things that they consider maybe to be easing the student athletes back into this kind of this new environment with a little bit more ease. And so I heard from one of the coaches today, and he said on his own he's making the decision that he's really going to keep his some of his competition this fall very local, and not have the first thing that he's going to do is put his team in an airplane and take a longer trip. And so, Brian, I guess I was just wondering, even about that any thoughts about some of the first things or things to consider for the coaches when they think about kind of, again, supporting the team when they get started in the fall?
Yeah, you know, I think it still comes to that creativity part, and when you think about the financial and logistical challenges of long distance travel and so forth, and it may be that this might even make sense in the long run, you know, that it makes sense to have things done much more regionally and so forth. So yeah, you know, we'll see. That's one of many ideas, and I know even there's a group of athletic directors and FBS, and they sort of floated the idea of trying to make a lot of things happen regionally, especially for non-football and basketball championships. And so, you know, we'll see where that goes, but I think it's important to think outside of the box. Now's the time to do that.
Hey, Brian, the last question I have here is, we've talked today about the resources that through NCAA.org and the Sports Science Institute that are available, both now and then, as Joni just referenced, as coaches and student athletes and students and others get back to campus. What are some things that you would, or words of advice that you would give to the head coaches listening to this about resources they should have in mind that are probably available on their own campus?
I think it's really going to be important more than ever. So we've always tried to emphasize that the coaches should, at the front end, work with the athletic staff. And so you identify what are the protocols for any injury or illness. So every single athlete on your team and every single one of the coaches and assistant coaches should understand, what's my protocol for an injury or illness? Similarly, it should be, what's my protocol if there's a mental health routine referral or an emergency referral? And I think at the front end too, it would be have a really, really frank discussion about what's the protocol for infectious disease control. And I think that has to be completely mapped out by everyone. And so it's going to include, and these resources we're going to be recommending, they should be spelled out at every school. So there would be a zero tolerance for a coach to allow anyone to come to a workout if he or she wasn't feeling well. You have a fever, you think you're coming down with a cold, you should let the correct person know, but you should not be coming to practice and potentially putting other people at risk. I think it's also, you know, the coach should be, when you reemerge and even beforehand, what's the protocol for testing for COVID-19? Are we going to have tests to see who's immune and who's not? Because you may find out that for a certain team that 80–90% of your players are immune. And that's a much different scenario than if only 10% are immune. And then what's the scenario for if someone is ill? So certainly they're not coming to practice, but for rapid diagnostic testing. So these are the things to really be thinking about. And again, as you read the new national guidelines, it'll help you formulate those questions in your mind, but that should absolutely be clearly articulated and rehearsed by every coach so that you understand what to do. Because the worst case scenario would be that you have a team that there's not a lot of immunity, and that someone comes to practice, they're not feeling well, and the next thing you knew, that individual has affected a large number of people on the team. So the coach should be really aware of that, and yes, you know, it's the team position and head athletic trainer, but I think the coach should also be taking personal responsibility just in terms of making certain that that's really well articulated.
Hey, Brian, if I may, you know, I'm sitting here thinking, I think, again, as a former athletic director and conference office staff member and the like, I think coaches need to fully understand that. I think it goes clearly against coaches' DNA to voluntarily take themselves out of service. Head coaches or assistant coaches. I mean, and the same would go for, you know, athletic directors or any one of us. I mean, in normal times, we're not feeling up to it. We're going to power through and be there to lead our student athletes and lead our program. But I would just ask this as a question to you. It would seem to me, based on what you just said, that would be borderline irresponsible even for a head coach or an assistant coach if they aren't feeling well and they have a fever to put themselves in that situation as well. And what I would, say is, if that's the case, they need to be prepared with their assistant coaches in an emergency situation, in a last minute situation, to be able to take over in his or her absence if it's a head coach who were to get sick with a fever. Is that fair to say, or is it different for a coach than it would be for a student athlete?
No, I think you're spot on. And so I'll give one analogy, and I think most coaches would understand this. I don't think any coach right now, if an athlete were bleeding actively, would try to, put your hand directly on that athlete's bleeding appendage and to try to stop the bleeding. You would use a glove or something like that, because we learned through hepatitis C and through AIDS, HIV, that you consider that all blood is potentially infectious. And so that's a universal thing that everyone has adopted. Well, I think now with COVID-19 and, that we should basically be saying that anyone who has symptoms of a cold, flu, something like that, that they're potentially infected and infective. And so it is the hallmark of being responsible, not to try to say, well, I'm going to tough this out, but to say, I'm not going to put my community at risk. Now, it's interesting, because is this going to be the new norm forever? Well, we don't know with certainty, but the great hope is that at some point in time, there's going to be massive herd immunity across the United States. And what does that mean? It means that there's going to be a universal vaccine that works, and so that some of this will be relaxed. But and sometimes we think about pre-vaccination and post-vaccination, but the world we're in right now is pre-vaccination. So I think it's a great point. You should assume that unless you know with certainty that you already have a complete immunity to this, that you're putting others at risk if you come to work sick. But even for a common flu, I mean, you wouldn't want to subject other teammates to developing a flu either, or even a cold. So it's a new norm, and it's a new norm of personal and social responsibility. I think that's a great point, Dan.
Yeah, there probably will be any number of things, hopefully good things, that will come out of this that we'll learn. So, so Brian, it looks like we're getting close to the end of the webinar. So I would really kind of like to just come back to a very simple question or comment that you made when we started, and that is, there are so many aspects of this. Our coaches are going to continue to have lots of questions, and so can we just wrap it up with again, that you would remind them, if they do have additional questions, how they can contact you, and and if we do get a lot of questions and there's interest, I know we all want to help, and we'll do this again anytime. Again, if we can be of assistance to our head coaches.
Yeah, so great point, Joni. So again, if you have questions, comments, suggestions, it's ssi@ncaa.org. And just please know we're really here for you. I mean, Lynn and Joni and Dan, I mean, they're every meeting we have, it's always, well, it's about the coaches and the coaches' relationship with the athletes. That's the core of who we are at the NCAA. So please know how we're here for you, and we want to be a resource for you. So Joni, Lynn, and Dan, thanks for taking the time with me today, and we look forward to staying connected. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for everybody tuning in.
Yeah.
Be well and stay safe. Appreciate what you do.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Take care.
All right.